So, it's that time of the year again. Leaves are falling, the weather is getting colder, and it's the perfect time to stay inside and get spooked. And what a better way than with some horror games. To be honest though, nowadays it seems that the horror games have been feeling rather lackluster. Now, this isn't a knock against any games that I do mention if you do enjoy them, since what is scary is always subjective to everyone. But personally, I feel with how graphics and gameplay have improved over the years, I still go back and appreciate the older titles more, especially with how they've handled themselves. Games like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and even Dead Space are timeless classics that still manage to be terrifying, even for today's standard. Just what is it about these old games that I enjoy? What was it that made all these games so successful? Well, we're going to take a look at it, one fixed camera angle at a time. We've talked about Resident Evil before on this channel, particularly the newer entries Resident Evil 8 and a little bit of 7, links down below for that. Back when the game first came out, it was something of an amazing experience. One where you would explore a huge mansion with scary monsters, from zombies to dogs and giant snakes, even giant killer crocodiles. So you know, a normal day in Florida. What made it work so well was how they chose to tackle how the player controlled and what they would see. The first thing to cover was the choice to use fixed camera angles. The decision was good for setting up tension and scares, since it made it easier to force the players to see exactly what the developers wanted them to see. The layout of the game complements the style of camera angles, since most areas are hallways with sharp turns and corners. This style of viewing the game also made it possible to use tank controls, since changing camera angles wouldn't cause any weird movement issues. Limiting the player's movement might seem like it would lead to a frustrating experience, but the layout of the mansion and the generally slow-moving enemies balances out. Other horror games would use this setup for their games with some tweaks, like Silent Hill, which kept the fixed camera angles with a slight amount of camera control. Where RE excelled, however, was putting the survival in survival horror, giving the player the ability to fight back or run away. This is always tough to balance out, since giving the players too much firepower takes attention away from encounters, while giving too little makes for a frustrating experience. Since the game had to be made with all these limitations in mind, having just the right amount of ammunition and encounters had to have more thought put into it. The best solution for this kind of dilemma would be the rare and extremely well hidden dynamic difficulty. This changes the game's difficulty based on the actions of the players in game. RE4 is the perfect example of this, affecting the player's ammo drop rates and enemy spawns depending on how well or not they were doing. Should a player find themselves dying constantly, the game would despawn some enemies and make them less aggressive, and if the player is scoring headshots and not getting hit, then the enemies will adjust and be more aggressive and deal more damage. Adjusting the game's challenges on the fly, depending on the player's actions, is a choice I wish more developers would put the effort in. It's understandable since it's a huge undertaking to implement. Even without dynamic difficulty, the original RE was such a success that its formula was used as a staple for many survival horror games that came after, such as Dino Crisis and the previously mentioned Silent Hill. Of course, there's another important part to video games that often gets underlooked or just not appreciated for the work they put into, and that is while gameplay is heavily important to a game, obviously, since that's the point of playing a game, one key part that most people don't tend to credit is the sound design. Music is critical to video games, but other sounds are just as important, such as enemy cries, feedback from guns, and even the little pitter-patter of your character's footsteps on different surfaces. In horror games, sound plays heavily into setting the right kind of atmosphere and mood, including those to terrify the player. After all, anyone that played the original RE2 will have this very sound etched into their nightmares. It's not just there to make the player shit their pants. It's also a way to give the players a heads up even when they can't see it directly. Imagine going down a hallway with a camera angle that doesn't let you see from the other corner and you hear that noise. I don't know about you, but I am nervous and getting ready to unload some grenade rounds into those bastards. Giving monsters distinct and recognizable sounds is key to their designs. It's the perfect tool to not only scare players, but give information in-game organically. No need to see a health bar or damage numbers to know a licker is dead when I hear its distinct dying screech. Monsters and enemies aren't the only sounds in games, however. Since building a right atmosphere is important, every sound is integral to the design of each shot. Characters' footsteps creaking on wooden flooring or squelching on mud outside. A door creaking when opened, leading to a room with a fireplace that crackles while a thunderstorm roars outside. All of these are just small, ambient noises, yet are important. All of them can add or hinder the atmosphere that the developers are trying to build. And when building an atmosphere, you definitely can't forget about the music. Horror games tend to have more ambient tracks, usually to allow the parts of the game to set up the tension. But some horror games do have some good music too. RE2's police station theme, for example, is memorable, haunting, and it has this sense of dread as you explore the zombie-infested police station. On the other hand, once it's time to decompress the player, the safe room music is a calm and soothing tune, letting them know that it's time to take a break from the horror. Silent Hill is also famous for some great music as well, from its title screen music to its beautiful piano themes for certain characters to the ear-piercing final boss theme, which even has a dentist drill mixed into it. As important as sound design is, there are moments where a game doesn't need to include any music, ambient or otherwise, and simply let the sights and sounds set the mood. Dead Space is the perfect example of this. Since there is no music for most of the game's exploration except for enemy encounters and set pieces, it's content letting the clinging and clanging of the industrial and metallic Ishimura fill in the silence. As you can see, making a great horror game is a very delicate process, but all of this is just a setup for So, now you have the player used to the controls and knowledgeable as to how to defend themselves. You've worked hard on the atmosphere, setting the ambiance, and composing the right type of music. The only thing left to do now is to give them the big old scare. But what is the scare? It's honestly hard to classify what makes something scary to someone. Like I said earlier, it's all subjective. There's also the problem where horror could just be a small part of a video game. Kinda like how every game now has RPG in its genre, even though the only thing about it can be as mundane as just having levels or skill trees. In general, the types of scares that horror games will strive towards depends on the type of game they are making. Some horror games give the players the ability to fight back against enemies. The best ones of those are the ones that can balance giving the player just enough items and ammo to be able to pick between fight or flight. Players should feel tense as they go through the game, not sure if they are prepared for the next encounter. It creates the perfect setup for unique jump scares, like preparing empty rooms or hallways that players go back and forth only for a monster to pop out of a window. This also gives the perfect environment for a pursuer type enemy. You know, big, strong, and relentless baddies that should bring out an "oh shit" out of the player. Of course, not every scary game has to have a heavy focus on combat. Some of them like to take a different kind of approach to horror, with slow and subtle fear. Silent Hill is the poster child for these kinds of moments, where the supernatural setting allows for the director to play with some scary moments that really can't be done in any form of media. My favorite scare will always be the mirror room in Silent Hill 3. I can't do the scene justice, nor do I want to take it away from you, so if you're at all curious, YouTube search Silent Hill 3 mirror room, or go experience it for yourself. The key takeaway from this is that the scene has a slow build-up, no loud noises, or animatronic bears jumping at you, and yet it remains memorable and terrifying for its execution. Honestly, Silent Hill, the place, not the game, is such a fantastic set piece for moments like that. Having the town be shaped by the minds of characters within it allows the developer to create something more abstract. Fears, psychological trauma, inner demons, taking these concepts and turning them into actual monsters that both the players and the characters will have to overcome. It's something that characterizes and humanizes the people in the game, showing us their fears in physical form. Now, when you take a look at the monster designs in these games, you take the time and try to understand why they take the form they do, and what they symbolize. It's also a way to explore darker and trickier subjects, at least if it's done tastefully, like suicide, depression, and other such forms. They don't make them like they used to. I hope you get even just a little bit more of an appreciation and respect for the kind of work that goes into making these types of games. Any good media always has a ton of extra thought, care, and work put into it, including these smaller pieces we take for granted. Modern AAA horror games nowadays seem to be missing the mark on what made their older games actually scary. It feels like big companies are afraid of limiting players with slower paced games and have to rely more on crazy set pieces and hyper-realistic gore. If I want more of a subtle horror with haunting atmospheres, it feels like I have to look at smaller AA games for it. The last modern AAA game that felt like it was a return to classic horror was PT. When that demo dropped, it had everybody talking about it, and for good reason, since that game pretty much did everything right, making it a truly scary experience. First person view with a slowed down pace, a familiar environment that would subtly change over time, letting the player notice the changes for themselves rather than having the game pointed out for them, building up an atmosphere using great ambient noises and lighting, like the static from the radio station or the dripping of blood from the ceiling. It was a game that you would just call a walking simulator with puzzle solving, but it absolutely nailed everything else that it did and turned out to be such a terrifying experience. Too bad Konami, being who they are, canned the whole thing and put it and the Silent Hill franchise back in pachinko jail. Either way, I hope more games like that come out, and if they do, that you make sure to give an extra bit of appreciation for all little things, especially for whoever decided to make Isaac curse like a sailor when he got some blood on his shoes. So, editor here, with some quick recommendations on some horror games you may or may not have heard of. I'm not going to go too in depth for these, but I'll give you a bit of information and tell you what they are about in a quick time before we end this video. First off, World of Horror, an RPG roguelike horror game where you investigate and solve mysteries while trying to stop the end of the world by eldritch gods. The art style is gorgeous, heavily inspired by Junji Ito, and the writing is fantastic. The game is basically done despite the early access tag, and more content just announced to be on the way. Well worth the price in my opinion. The second game is a survival horror series called Fatal Frame. Like Silent Hill, the series leans heavily on the supernatural side of horror. Gameplay has players use a magical camera to snap pictures of ghosts to fend them off. The atmosphere is fantastic even in the older titles, and the series tends to get better gameplay-wise with each new entry. Personally, I would recommend starting from the first one to see how it evolves over the series. Tormented Souls is a relatively new release, which I want to make a separate video on. Trust me, it's classic horror. So if you liked fixed camera angles and tank controls, go play it now. And on that note, thank you for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like, and if you have any feedback, make sure to leave it in the comments below. Hope you all have a great Halloween. See y'all in the next one.